did get another career shift.
Rebecca has to cause the size. So it'd be offending if I say red card.
I see that you're wrong.
I was thinking.
Oh, there's certainly more investment. We have to divide it by 50. I haven't been active I did my initial survey, which was very disappointing. I'm rewriting some of the history of ICT from this subject SPRU, starting with the social. Made good progress.
Okay. I think the
When you say it.
okay.
But I wasn't able to find any connection to the early ICT, the three sectors that were considered.
Suppose we start. Suppose we start.
Not in terms of governing techniques. They're just other concrete models.
Can you please sit down? Well, you can reserve, certainly for you, Carlota. Okay, it's with a big pleasure I open this book presentation and debate. This is the occasion is the book published by Judith Sutz and Rodrigo Arocena, and Bo Gurenson. He's not here, but we're very happy to have you here to debate this book. It's about the developmental universities in inclusive innovation systems, as you can see. But in general, it's about the future of the university. And I think this is a very topical debate also for, well, our system to discuss this. They focus on the developing world, but I think we can have a broader discussion. So the order is that we first have an introduction to the book, then we have distinguished commentators, and then we have a general discussion. Okay? So please.
Well, thank you very much. The three authors feel most honored to be able to present here our book, and we thank you very much. We work in development studies, and we believe that perhaps a new period is starting because, first of all, of fear. Fear about climatic problems, fear about the consequences of rising inequality. In such context, we shall talk about universities understood as potential key actors in the needed transitions to sustainability and inclusion. We will address two issues. One is a methodological guide to consider development, and the second one, a discussion around the role of universities in development. Concerning the first, we assume that development involves values, facts, trends, and actions. So development studies should combine four approaches: a normative approach, a factual, or better, a theoretical factual approach, a prospective approach, and a propositional approach. At least in Latin America, we usually confuse these issues, and when we discuss about state and market, one is not sure if the normative issues under discussion, or the factual issue, or the policy issue. In any case, I would like to stress that when we speak about propositional approach, it includes, of course, policies, but it is not restricted to policies, because proposals can be addressed to other collective actors more generally. Well, we will start with a normative approach, as we should, because values should be the starting point. They both shape the research agenda and they shape the type of proposals that are considered desirable. What do we need of a normative approach? Of course, it must be ethically strong. If it's not, it is not a normative approach. But it must also be widely accepted in order to be able to be the basis for action. And it must be a guide for that. We think that sustainable human development has such properties. It combines the notion of sustainable development, very well known, with human development, also very well known, and understood as the expansion of capabilities and freedoms being both the goal and the main tool for development. Sustainable development goals give very concrete content to the normative approach. And three consequences, at least, follow from this normative approach. First, development is not the same as economic growth. Second, is not about the South catching up with the North. And third, development concerns both South and North, although in different ways. Concerning the factual approach, I am going to concentrate my attention on two issues: the role of power and the development. Development has to do with people having the power to live valuable lives. Power stems in no small measure from the mutual influences between technology and social relations. Nowadays, advanced knowledge has become the main basis of power, and so learning is a fundamental social process. In this context, we want to go back to the old notion of underdevelopment. Perhaps today it can be defined as the combination of production weakly based on knowledge with external dependence. It is a main obstacle for development. And we want also to stress in this context the role of the innovation system framework, seeing innovation system as the set of factors and their interactions that mainly shape generation and use of knowledge. When elites do not face countervailing powers in innovation systems, innovation mainly favors the already favored, and systems are not inclusive. Allow me to end with some very small remarks concerning the prospective and propositional approaches. Concerning the prospective approach, we stress two obviously and well-known trends. First, prevailing socio-technical regimes, if they are not changed, will keep increasing environmental damage. And second, knowledge-based inequality will keep increasing because knowledge increases with its use and decreases without it. We see a learning divide emerging in the world, perhaps a clue of stratification understood as distribution of power, a learning divide between those who are able to learn and keep on learning at advanced level when they work and those who are not able to do that. Then, a keep for policies stems. Not the only one, but perhaps one that it is important. Transitions to sustainability and inclusion have knowledge democratization as one of its main requisites. Democracy was famously defined as government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We could say that knowledge democratization is about knowledge of the people, by the people, and for the people. All this puts the focus on universities because they can give concrete content to the idea of knowledge democratization as a fundamental tool for sustainable human development. And now we shift to Judith.
Well, we can say that the soul of the universities is at stake, and we can ask which is their social role. First, a polemic assertion. Neither the old dominant model, the Humboldtian university, nor the new dominant model, the entrepreneurial university, will contribute to redressing inequality and underdevelopment. In a very stylized way, we can say that the Humboldtian university may be characterized as driven by international standards without much attention to social concerns. And the entrepreneurial university can be characterized by being committed to the capitalization of knowledge, which means that knowledge and learning will go to those that will pay for it. Okay, an inspiration. I hope that you are not going to think that we are Latin American chauvinists. But exactly a century ago, in June 1918, in Córdoba, Argentina, the Latin American university reform movement shaped an ideal of socially committed university. It aimed at democratizing the university mainly via the participation of students in some governance in order to foster the contribution of universities to the democratization of highly unequal society, as the Latin American societies were then and in general still are. A conjecture. Universities can promote knowledge democratization in the context of inclusive innovation systems, thus becoming developmental universities, a notion no distant from some European ways of naming universities as engaged or civic university. This implies the last two things. Oh, sorry. The first is a will, an internal will of universities to promote knowledge democratization. But second, an external context, inclusive innovation system, that expects university to be committed to that aim, that asks for new types of results, and that uses such results. Universities alone can do little. Combined with other actors in inclusive innovation system, they may become extremely powerful tools of change. Main task of development universities, of course, teaching, in such a way that it contributes to generalization of advanced lifelong learning. Small example. In Uruguay, in 2014, 64% of the students entering the university were the first in their families going to university. Good result. But they came from the countryside, from not so good high schools, and then the possibility of dropping out university is very high. So teaching in a developmental university means paying attention to avoid dropping out. Research in the whole gamut of knowledge and culture, paying special attention to development issues. This means building research agendas that pay attention to context, that search problems that may not have agency, may not have voice, because those that have the problems are part of the marginalized as part of the population. So it's not simply problems come to me. We have to go to the problems, because if not, the research part of the developmental universities are not going to be there. Cooperating with external actors in the interactive learning process oriented to solving collective problems with priority given to those of the private sector. Here the concept of co-production is very, very important. And of course, combining those three tasks. And then came the idea of connected autonomy. That is not a given, it is a complex social construction. It's different both from autarky and from subordination. It is needed for fulfilling the above-mentioned task. Inside universities, not connected universities are not good for this task. And foster creating collaboration with progressive public policies and promote inclusive innovation systems. Autonomy is a very polycentric term. We know that. We know that here in Europe, autonomy means something very, very different than from, for instance, in Latin America. Connected autonomy retains the notion of academic freedom, blending it with social commitment and collective action. On possibilities. An obstacle, prevailing evaluation systems that hamper academic contribution to inclusion and sustainability. This is a big, big problem. We are glad that all over the world, more and more people are fighting against the prevailing research evaluation system. From the Declaration of Research Assessment of the Biologists of San Francisco to the Leiden Manifesto, everybody is worried about. Why is such an obstacle? Because academic contribution to inclusion and sustainability takes a lot of time. And people that runs after paper and paper and paper don't have really time to devote themselves to the very complex problems around inclusion and sustainability. But we have to say the following. Being against the prevailing in research evaluation doesn't mean that research evaluation is not a must. It is a must. So the point is to do it differently. And then is when the concept of dev metrics, add metric, this metric, dev metric is developmental metrics. It's a way of measuring the contribution to development, and given that evaluation is not only about the past, but is a signal about the future, saying researcher what is worth to produce. Who are the potential internal and external stakeholders of developmental universities? Young people, students in particular, who wants to live in a sustainable world. Academics, motivated to include social goals in the research agenda, and believe me, North and South, plenty of them. We have to help them. Governments and political parties that foster developmental coalitions, particularly for overcoming underdevelopment and for shaping alternative paths to development. Sectors aiming to upgrade economic performance by means of learning and sustainability, and this is perhaps for you in Europe given for granted. For us in the developing world, it's not. Popular actors that understand that their estrangement for advanced education and knowledge reinforce their subordination to the power structure. To finish, this is the last one. I am going to quote, I don't often quote part of the Córdoba Manifesto when the 1918 started. From now on, only the true builders of souls, the creators of truth, beauty, and good, will be able to be masters in the University Republic. romantic. It was the age. The concept of good is of course polycentric, but developmental universities are committed to one of these meanings, working towards sustainable human development and inclusive innovation system through a radical democratization of knowledge. And as a famous song goes, you may say we are dreamers, but we are not dreamers. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, so let me say, read the book. That's one important recommendation. But we also say that both Judith and Rodrigo are excellent people to assess and to promote this, given your own history and work. And Rodrigo being rector of a university himself in Uruguay. And Judith, let me also say, is a Chris Freeman visiting fellow at SPRU at the moment. So we're very happy again for you to promote this vision of the university, which is relevant, I think, across the world. Well, we have three commentators. One is Carlota Perez. Well, Carlota is also, I think, an excellent commentator because she worked in Latin America. She knows the Latin American context. But she also really worked in a whole range of universities in Europe, including currently at the University of Estonia, where she is teaching. So Carlota will be the first. And then we have Soete. And Luc, although he said that he may not be the best commentator, he told me, but he has been rector magnificus, University Maastricht, so he also knows about universities and the development of universities. And of course has a much broader view also about innovation systems and development of them. And finally, I'm very glad to say we'll have a comment by one of our students, Arthur Gomes. He's a PhD student in Science Technology Policy Studies here at SPRU. And you're working on the problems of the Brazilian government in agricultural research, right? And you're supervised by Joe's Chataway, Tommaso Charlie, and Alberto Marsuzzi. So we have three commentators. They all have 7 minutes, and then we go for a general debate. So, but let's start with Carlota.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Rodrigo and Judith, apart from being fantastic researchers and innovators and have a lot of experience, lived in Venezuela for quite a few years when they were exiled from the dictatorship in Uruguay, so I know them for a long, long time. And I value them from a long, long time. So I'm going to give some reflections, I say, because what I'm doing is looking at their book from my technological revolutions point of view. So what I'm going to say, fundamentally, is that the book is very timely. It comes just in time for what we now need. And I will try to explain why I think it's so timely. I think the ICT revolution has radically changed the development possibilities in the global south. Whether we're taking advantage of them fully or not is, of course, the answer is, of course, not. But we could. And what I see happening is, first of all, that we lived in a world of dependency that was real. It was real that we were dependent during the post-war boom and the further years. Even import substitution was a completely dependent type of technology. We're dependent technologically, we're dependent economically, and it really meant that you couldn't really innovate. Sorry. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that today, leapfrogging and autonomous innovation, I'm very glad that Luc Soete is my co-commentator today, because we wrote an article about leapfrogging in the 1980s, and autonomous innovation are now possible everywhere. But what that means is that the institutional framework that was designed for the previous context is simply inadequate. And that's true in the north and in the south. And that includes, of course, universities,
I think our universities are mass production systems still. They're still huge, heavy pyramids. They're still separated by, I mean, SPRU is a very rare interdisciplinary, super open space. It's unique almost. I mean, there are very few in the world that are of that sort. Now, what we need is not just university. We need major institutional innovations urgently. And that's in the north and in the south. So what I think is that the developmental university that they have presented to us could be the key innovation for taking advantage of the new opportunities. What I hold is that capitalism opens and closes opportunities. The southern countries of the global south made leaps of growth in the third revolution in the 1870s and 1910s, two 1910s. Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, Uruguay itself made quite a leap. The south of Brazil, Chile, everybody who was in the southern hemisphere because of steamships could be incorporated into that global economy, and many countries made quite big leaps, and of course Australia and New Zealand went ahead to become developed countries. But during the age of the automobile and mass production from the 1910s, especially 1920s, and certainly with the post-war boom, the whole of the so-called third world was excluded. So that's why we were dependent, and of course what we had to do was to make sure that both energy and materials were very cheap, so that salaries in the north could be very high, so salaries made sure that there was demand, and energy and materials made sure that there was supply, cheap supply with both those things, and that's how it happened. But today, in the advanced countries, inequality is increasing. And in the early decades of each revolution, it happens in the developed countries. And in the advanced countries, it decreases in the golden ages. So there is this phenomenon, and recently we have had inequality increasing within countries, but it's been decreasing between countries. Because of course, we have China, we have India, we have the rising, and even lots of innovation in Africa. I mean, there's a big change, but it's not yet, we don't have anywhere near what would be possible. Just to look at the pendulum of inequality that swings back and forth with each technological revolution, we can use Piketty and size figures. I mean, it's really obvious that in the 1920s, when we had the boom, the high point of the boom of the 1920s, the roaring 20s, and then the down, we had up to 25%, 1% of the population was getting 25% of the income. And we have it again. With the 2000s bubble, we have the same 25% for the 1% of the population. But look at the middle. During the post-war golden age, it was only 10%. So that is why we can call it a golden age. So with each revolution, you have the two phenomena. But during that golden age of the post-war, that excluded the South. So what's happening now? In this revolution, we could have a global sustainable golden age. Global and sustainable, socially sustainable, and environmentally sustainable. But for that, we need the right institutions. We need the right policies and the right institutions, and if we don't find them, we could miss the opportunity. Now, why is the university so crucial now? Because the available technological potential depends more than ever on knowledge and know-how. It always did. I mean, Schumpeter always says that growth depends. You know, that's what we learn, that growth depends on innovation. But now, it really depends on whether you have the knowledge and know-how, whether you democratize it. ICT enables diversity and adaptability to preserve and enhance national, regional, local, and cultural identities. So we're talking about a completely new world, not the homogenizing world of mass production where everybody had to have the exact same house with the car and the electrical appliances and the consumerist society and all this. We're talking about a very different world as possible, not necessarily probable. It all depends on us. And adequate innovation, remember in the 1970s and the 1980s we used to talk about appropriate innovation, adequate innovation. We dreamt, in fact some people defined it as labor using rather than capital using. No, we're now talking about really adequate for good lives everywhere. But it will increasingly depend on the mastery of specific knowledge and the weaving of networks for sharing it. It's the networks for sharing knowledge that will make the difference. The possible path of each country will be defined by the nature of its universities. So there are 4 essentials points that I find in the book. The first one is this idea that developed countries simply do not exist. Not if we mean sustainable human development, but because it's true. They're really very, maybe Sweden was, there is a little bit of that. But the main thing is that sustainable human development cannot be attained if the goal is simply growth. This is something that they argue very thoroughly. Then that democratization of knowledge is the route to empowering society. And 4, the very important point of evaluation criteria being crucial to determine if the normative goal is truly pursued. If you're looking for sustainable human development, you can't just count papers. You can't just count publications in universal journals. That's one part of it, but it's a relatively small part of it, because even that should be contained within this normative goal of sustainable human development. So in my view, achieving what Rodrigo's and Judith have called the developmental university could make the difference between succeeding or failing to take advantage of the current opportunities. And that is why this book is so timely. Thank you.
Well, let me also, first of all, thank the organizers for having invited me to be able to say a few words on the presentation of this book of Rodrigo and Judith, and it's always a delight to see you back, at least Judith. I'm not saying this about Rodrigo because it's been far too long ago since I saw him last, as he mentioned, it was somewhere in Brazil. But it's also, for me, it's also very timely, but in a very different sense, I was going to say, because exactly at the same moment as today, Caroline Hoxby is giving a presentation in Maastricht on education and on higher education and the rate of return to higher education. And some of you might know Caroline Hoxby from Stanford, but she's the one who is raising grave doubts about the economic return to online education. And I thought it was good for the Sussex colleagues to be reminded of this, and I couldn't resist of mentioning this, etc. But she's also dealing, of course, with access from poor families, etc., to higher education, etc. So it is indeed very timely. When I looked at it and I first started to read the book, the notion of developmental universities was sort of, I looked back at your quotes from Coleman in '86, and let me just quote this, what he meant. In their own self-interest, universities of the Third World might critically examine and continuously monitor what functional load they can realistically and responsibly assume and ensure that their performance, whatever mix and magnitude of traditional developmental functions they select to take on, is both manageable and creditable. And that definition didn't, I mean, I'm sure you will agree with me, Judith, it did not sound very attractive. I mean, to talk a little bit in Carlota's term, it looks like you have appropriate universities. And I don't think this is really what we are talking about when we deal really with the notion of this kind of universities which address inequality, we address democratization of knowledge. And let me give you my view on the current education paradox, in which I make a strong distinction between the global south and the north. And I would say that in the north, the fundamental challenge at the moment about education is not higher education, but it is education at the primary and the secondary level. It's the fact that all the minority groups in society, how can you indeed provide much more resources in terms of childcare, primary and secondary education, where you can see that the failing rates are so high. And to some extent, this is the ultimate paradox of education. That is, in the north, the challenge is the education in terms of primary, secondary, because it's investing in there which will raise the quality to some extent of your higher education. Because if you think indeed of the challenges of migration, of refugees, etc., challenges of people, and I'm talking here not so much maybe about the UK, but many of the European countries, by most refugees, etc., don't know a word of the local language, and hence the children do have immediately a language disadvantage. These are the really major challenges. Whereas in the South, as you explain further well in the book, the challenges is really at the higher education level. And this is the paradox, that is that both at the UN and other agencies, one has focused exactly on the opposite. I think this is why I would very much welcome the idea of these developmental universities, and this is the way I interpret them, as really moving away from upfront basic education, which was the Millennium Development Goal 2, towards the role and the crucial role of higher education, and in this sense the developmental university notion is a very interesting one, because it addresses inclusiveness in a direct way. But what is then the challenge of today? Well, the challenge of today, and this is where I become more critical as I go on, and where you say very little about, is of course that 1918 or 1968, if I may talk about my revolution at university levels, is of course not 2018 in one dramatic sense, and that is of course, as you can see it in the room here, the mobility of students and the brain circulation. And that mobility of students, of course, to what extent does that allow the dream of Carlota and the ideal proposals of a developmental university? Because students will go for excellence in teaching, they will go for excellence in research, they will go for employment opportunities, and the brain drain, even if I look simply at Europe, I mean, in this kind of discussions on the Tour d'Europe I had to do with respect to knowledge investment, the complaints from countries like Portugal or like Spain, the way in which we at Maastricht University just benefit from that talent, attracted, given also the demographics, is really one of the most fundamental challenges, with basically no transfer of resources whatsoever. So how do you then develop these developmental universities in an inclusive sense when you are completely in a global world with massive mobilities of students, staff and talents? There is one thing where I would be a step more critical, and that's of course the, as you put it, Judith, the contradiction between the Humboldt and the entrepreneurial universities. If you really look, and your book focuses very much on this in a very interesting way, on the third mission, and the role of the third mission in its local impact. Now that fits very much with all these notions of smart specialization strategies as we have it in Europe, and the local context for your students, your graduates, etc. And that, of course, by definition means practically that the institutions which are there to learn and to teach, whether they are excellent university or research university or they're professional universities or higher education establishment, do have a responsibility which goes in the direction of entrepreneurial dynamism. And in there, I would say, why would entrepreneurial universities be in contradiction with inclusiveness? What about social entrepreneurship? What about social innovation, social impact bonds, social incubators, social crowdfunding? So in this sense, my challenge would be to you that nothing prevents you to have these developmental universities to become really entrepreneurial in a social sense. Entrepreneurial is really, in its contradiction, the way it was put as opposed to academic capitalism in a certain way, was put as something which cannot satisfy this social inclusion. And I would really say that I would disagree with that line. There are lots of small details like electing a rector, which I would of course also disagree with. So please, be fast. Thank you so much.
Okay, finally, Arthur.
Thanks for the opportunity. It's tricky to follow up for that. I'm not only a student here, but I'm the newest student of SPRU, so I just started in February. So I thought about a contribution that I could have is, of course, from my student. One would be to bring questions. So I'll start with that. I have three, and then I can, if I have some time, maybe comment a little bit. But that's most of my contribution, I guess. So can this approach to study the developmental university be used in order to study other research institutions? And here, of course, I'm going to have to cite the example of my own research, which is Embrapa. Embrapa was created in the 70s in Brazil in order to do agriculture research. So I wondered if the Developmental University framework could be used in order to study particularly the issue of connected autonomy there. After the democratization of Brazil in '81, there was a lot of complaints from the presidents and people that ruled in Embrapa because they said there was not enough autonomy after that. While in the 70s, between some torture and some assassination and the other that the dictatorial government produced in that time, they said that it was completely autonomous for them. The second would be, if you could, Judith, being academic coordinator of the Research Council, and Rodrigo have an experience being rector, tell us about the troubles that you found when trying to encourage this type of discussion in Uruguay. Was the dev metric implemented there? How was it? And of course, I'd like to see if you have any tips for us students that are going to be researchers or are recent researchers now, trying to do a bit of a science that differs from what's been doing today, has been done today in matters of quantity or publication in international journals that might not be interested in the Latin American problems. But we also need to get some nice jobs in order to pay for the debts that we are getting here. So when I was reading this book, one author kept coming to my mind, and that is funny because it was two Uruguayans here that made it happen, and it was two Uruguayans in the turn of the century that made that discussion happen. It was, Celso Furtado, he is a Brazilian structuralist, and in the end of the 70s he wrote about dependency, but from a different perspective of industrialization and the CEPAL approach. He was focused on culture, and it was Octavio Rodriguez and Oscar Burgueño, I don't know.
Sí, Oscar Burgueño.
Sí, Burgueño. They were the ones that brought the attention to that matter again. So for them, Furtado was the one that it was different from the structures because he brought the theme of culture when discussing underdevelopment. And so according to Furtado, to tackle underdevelopment means to have the capacity to create solutions to specific problems of society. And that means to have, and also to have access to culture is to have a creativity capacity. So creativity is an element of power. It's the ability of someone to impose her will, to contest the logic of accumulation, to discuss the means and ends of a society. And it was great to see in the book that I could relate it to a more concrete thing, which is the role of the Developmental University. So being the role of how can I call it, Dev Uni, the role of the Dev Unit is to build an inclusive system innovation, make sure education, research, and advanced knowledge are used to tackle social challenges. And in the book, there are suggestions on how to do that. For example, accepting the third mission of the new Humboldtian University extension, which we do that in Brazil, as you mentioned, but not to the full extension, I guess. And the dialogue and engagement with activities outside the academy, cultural diffusion, and technical assistance. So maybe, just to conclude, Furtado, he would argue that the Dev Unit has this double role in dealing with these two aspects of the dependency in Latin America. The technological dependency, which is expanding endogenous, to tackle it, it means to expand endogenous capabilities, focus on our underdevelopment context. And in the cultural dependency, which can be tackled by engaging people in the debate about the ends of the development, the myth of progress, the logic of accumulation that has taken over since the Industrial Revolution. And Furtado saw three areas where this logic was contested, and the sustainability, the environmental discussion, the gender studies, and the fair reproduction of humanity, and in the arts. And all those three areas are deeply presented in the university context. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. You can stay there. All the commentators can sit in the chairs there. And you two. I would first like to give Rodrigo and Judith an opportunity to respond, but not too long, because to the issues raised, and then we can have some more questions from the floor. Okay, Judith, if you can start to...
Shall we start?
Yes, give a brief response.
Well, we'll be very brief. We thank you very much. We feel very encouraged. We hope Carlota sends us her slides because we need to study them carefully. Concerning what Luke said, I will only make one point. Entrepreneurial university has been defined in at least two completely different senses. One is the sense given by Burton Clark, which equates entrepreneurial university, in fact, with innovative university. We have nothing to discuss with that model. The other model, the one we dare criticize in our book, is the one defined in the following way. The entrepreneurial university is characterized by the third mission of capitalizing knowledge. That means that generation and use of knowledge will be mainly directed by demand with purchasing power. Demand that can pay for knowledge, to say it in a very simplified way. Well, social demand not always can pay for knowledge. And underdeveloped demands has a similar trait. In that sense is that we say that the one acception of entrepreneurial university will not help to redress underdevelopment or fight inequality. Concerning Arthur, I'm going to say three brief things. Suggestions for students. We are very old people. Our suggestion will be, dare make your own mistakes. That's all the suggestion we have to do. We also come from the 68, and that's what we learned. We were able to make our own mistakes. So please do your own mistakes. They are going to be much better than ours, sure. What are the main problems in Uruguay? I could talk half an hour and Judith half a day, probably. So we won't. But I would say that perhaps the main problem is lack of confidence on our own capabilities. Christopher Freeman will relate that with what he called voluntary underdevelopment. When we speak about voluntary underdevelopment in Latin America, some good friends get really furious with us. But voluntary underdevelopment is part of the ideological dimension of development. And to put an end to this brief comment in order to listen, we are very pleased to hear Arthur speaking about Furtado. He was one of the greatest economists, and not only economists, in the period when development theory in Latin America, the heterodox approach to development theory, was invented and developed. He was a theorist, a practitioner, a fighter against dictatorship. We feel honored that his name is here.
Okay.
Perhaps we can just start discussion.
Okay.
I have notes, and I know that we haven't addressed everything, but
So she'll answer tougher questions.
Okay.
yeah, the global world.
Okay, so let's see. Let's take a number of questions. So who wants to start with a comment, a question? Please. Can you introduce yourself, just your name and sort of the panel?
My name is Andrea Atlane. I'm a PhD student here at SPRU. And thank you so much for the authors and for the commentators for such an exciting presentation. And I look forward to reading the book. My question is goes back to the relationship between the entrepreneurial and the developmental university, but it's more on the action stream. And in particular, looking for having in mind that in Latin America, many of the largest universities are not only public but free of fees or require low fees of students. I wonder if you have any thoughts and if you could share with them about how to finance the developmental university without privatizing knowledge, keeping it open and accessible as well. Thank you.
That's a topical question.
Absolutely.
Low fees.
It is topical. We are talking about universities, but there are different species of universities. If you have to pay and to have loans and get indebted for all your life, and if you have free access, in Latin America, the biggest and the most research-oriented universities are absolutely free of charge. Universidad de San Pablo, Universidad de Buenos Aires, Universidad de la República, Universidad Autónoma de México, all of them. So it's really a different situation. But let me tell you that in my view, developmental universities, shifting towards developmental universities, first of all, is not a step. It is a slow process. It can be in research a little bit, and then in teaching, and then in extensionism, the name in Latin America of the third mission. And it need not to be too much expensive. You can do it with the research that we have now. It's a shift in interest. It's more than that. And I have the conviction that if people are allowed to work in more meaningful questions for society, they will be happy to do that. The problem is that they cannot do it alone. We cannot put the burden of being socially responsible in the shoulders of individual people. This is, as Carlota would say, an institutional responsibility. And for that, you don't need more money. What you need is new questions, is new visions, that not necessarily are to be accompanied by bigger budget. But I understand, and this is very good that you put the question, that the situation is totally different in different parts. And the issue of evaluation has to do with it. Because if students go, as Luke said, to excellence in teaching, excellence in research, and job opportunities, probably being high in the ranking is a very important economic asset for a university. And so it's very difficult to combine changing evaluation and what's going on with the rankings. So in our country, this is not needed. So we have to understand that we need to talk in a pluralistic way, but probably the problem here in the North can become much more complicated.
Okay. Shall we take 2 more questions? Helga, Alan, and Joe, 3 questions. You take them?
I would like to ask Judith and Rodrigo, how do you take into account the enormous possibilities that Carlota was talking about that come with the new technologies? Now, whenever new technologies arise in society, we go through a dream of an emancipatory phase. We think now it will be possible to democratize because everyone has access, it will become cheaper, etc. And then, as was the case with the internet, we discovered some of this was an illusion. Some of it is working, but other things are an illusion. And we went through the phase in education of thinking, now that we can do MOOCs, wonderful. You know, people in Africa, in wherever, who have no access even to schools, are able to access knowledge. We found out, yes, they do have access to knowledge, but it's done in a very patchy way. So there's no continuity. There's no feedback that allows the students really to build up learning where you have certain sequences that work better than if you just, you know, drop in, drop out, drop in, drop out. And then we have online education, which by many is seen as a cheap way of providing education. For instance, if you take the case in the US of the Arizona State University, Michael Crow, very social entrepreneurial president of ASU, rightly says, you know, I am the president of a public university, and in order to reach out to students in Arizona State that cannot afford these high fees, at least I can provide a solid online education. But we also know, unless you combine online education with face-to-face interaction to monitor, to guide the students, etc. So we have these possibilities, and there are other possibilities that we do not really make use of. For instance, how students can learn from each other. And here the new technologies are fantastic because they allow new ways of peer group learning. Yeah. So to what extent does this come into your developmental university, and how does it play out?
Okay, you take Alan.
I'm Alan Freeman. I have 3 questions that are related. The first is, how is it possible that in an age of so much knowledge there is so much ignorance? And that's not an easy question to answer. The second question is, do you think the function of the university should be concentrating on the provision of instruction or the alleviation of the facilitation of learning? Because I think those are 2 different conceptions. The third is, in your list of things that we have to deal with, pestilence, sorry, I'm thinking of the apocalypse, but the horse person, the 5th horse person of inequality, there's a horse person who's also there, which is war. War is a danger, it's taking place on every continent. And then I want to relate these 3 together in the following way. There are 2 ways. There's a tendency to think of ignorance as something that is a state of being. It is also something that can be inflicted. You can inflict ignorance on people by telling them something that is not true. And if you tell them something that is not true and you punish them for believing everything else, you create ignorance. It's not just there, you create it. How is that related to the difference between instruction and facilitation of learning? It's that if you see your function as being to facilitate learning, you must facilitate people finding out truth, even if what you're telling them is wrong. If you don't provide for that, you're not fulfilling the function of the university that develops the human being by encouraging that human being to think for themselves. Why does this relate to war? Because what's happening in a state of... The question is really, what is the function of a university in a condition of war? Because as war approaches, information and knowledge are seen as instruments. More and more we hear people talking about information war. And that means that people will be trying to tell us what we can say and what we can't say to our students. So they are telling us state actors are beginning to become increasingly involved, the world over. I'm not talking about any particular state actor. There's a generalization of state actors wishing to make sure that the provision and purveyance of information and knowledge is under the control of the state. So how can the universities provide for their independence and the autonomy and the learning capacities of their students in these circumstances? Because I think if they don't, they will be contributing to the increase of ignorance, and they should be contributing to its decrease.
Well, that's a small lecture in itself. Thank you, Ellen. Joe.
Yeah, I thought your comments about confidence and prestige and building up confidence was just fascinating. But my question was, if we were to come up with a new ranking based on the dead uni, who, in your experience of looking across at universities that you know, who would you put at the top? And who would you put at the bottom? More interesting, actually.
Tricky question.
Okay. Well, let's take the 3 questions, and perhaps Luc, you can you, if you want to respond to the issue of fees, because in the UK they're very high, in the Netherlands they are moderate. But I just want to know, as an economist also, how you think about the issue of fees. But let's first take these questions, and I'll come back to you about the issue of fees. How do you want to respond to this?
Division, we will need to write another book to answer half of the questions. We do not intend to write the book in the following 5 minutes, so I do my best and then Judith will do better. I would say, concerning a small part of the comments that we thank so much, that what Elga was saying has to do with a main difference between the digital divide and the learning divide. For many years, Manuel Castel spoke about the digital divide, and we only said the digital divide is a very complicated issue, but that's not the main issue. The main issue is the learning divide, the possibilities of learn and keep on learning. And for that, when we had some responsibilities in our university, we repeated always something that I think that you were backing. Even those who have many resources and live quite near the university should take part of their teaching online. And even those who are very far away should be given the opportunity to take face-to-face teaching. Because without that, without autonomous learning, you don't have a university level teaching. And without face-to-face cooperative looking at the eyes of your students and guessing what it is that they are not understanding, and not explaining them, but suggesting something that's fundamental. So I would say that the digital divide is complicated, but the learning divide are much more complicated. Concerning the several questions by Alan, which Judith will manage better than I would only recall something very, very old, the difference between instruction and active teaching. Active teaching goes back to Socrates, so it's not something new, but it has a very precise definition. Active teaching means that the main actors of teaching are not we, the teachers, but the students. So you have to organize the teaching with that in mind. That means combining teaching by disciplines with problem-based teaching, etc., etc. That was the main stronghold of the Humboldtian University. Humboldt wrote it, to combine teaching and research is very good for research, but especially good for teaching, because students are taught in an ambience of creation and they become early creators. One of the main programs in our university, they were very fought against by old academics or old-fashioned academics, is the program for fostering student research. That is, how can students in the second or third year of the university, with adequate backing from academics, start doing research? Of course, we don't expect they to solve many problems, although sometimes they do solve them, but that's a way of active teaching. And I won't skip the financial issues. They are very complicated. I don't know what is your experience, and the experience of a rector in Uruguay is fighting with the government for money. So that I lived 8 years doing that. Latin America is usually. In order to have lifelong advanced learning, you can't think that you are going to teach only in higher education institutions, or that only we professors are going to teach. But that's not a very original thing to say. Where have the medical faculty been teaching for 1,000 years? In the faculty, but in the hospital. Can't we understand that every place where something socially valuable is well done is potentially a teaching place? Can't we think that everybody who does well something socially valuable is a potential teacher? When we say such things, our colleagues do not love us, because they think that we are taking away their jobs. But if we really want to teach a whole generation, then we'll have to do those things. That will help us to find financial resources and human resources that are more important.
When Alan was asking the question, so much knowledge and so much ignorance, I remember that Chris Freeman, in 2003, he cannot come to the first Globalix conference in Rio, but he sent a message. And the message included a poem, 1932, by Eliot, that says, "Where is the wisdom we lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we lost in information?" This is a long-standing question. On the other hand, Richard Nelson wrote a famous book in 1970, The Moon and the Ghetto, and he asked, how could it be? We went to the moon, and we are not able to deal with the ghetto. And it has something to do with what we are discussing here, with the difference between a developmental way of looking for knowledge and other ways of looking for knowledge. I think that what Luke put forward about globalization, about, you said it, Spanish and Portuguese, Spain and Portugal giving their best people to other places. Look at Africa. This is a real problem. This is a real problem, because we can say the world, we are not equal. The North is really a strong attractor. And the only thing we can do is to give meaning to our way of doing things, to become good attractors of our better and more committed people to do different things. Many will flow away. But if we can retain, by giving meaning, social meaning, developmental meaning, to our brightest students, and we can do that, and this is a very fundamental challenge of a developmental university, it could be good. And then, Johan, I have the slightest idea of how to build a different, because it's not a problem of countries, it's a problem of universities, and even of departments in universities. I am not going to flatter our costs, but I think that SPRU is going to be quite high, I have to say. Because you are discussing really fundamental things, and you are open, and you give freedom to people to think whatever you allow, being heterodox. You don't say, this is so fundamental. But perhaps, I am quite confident, because we are not alone. There is an international issue about that. You know what is saturation in sociology? I am reading, and I cannot find any new argument. I read 30 years after the research assessment exercise, the consequences of it, and I read after 25 years of national system of research in Mexico, and they are absolutely identical. How could it be? Because science has some kind of uniqueness and some kind of way of assessing have the same results, and people are getting upset all over the world. So now we have an opportunity really to fight together and to try to build an alternative, and then we shall start measuring, and perhaps 5 years we are going to answer Johan's question.
Well, I would like to give the other 3 panelists the final word, because we need to end. But let me say one thing about the rankings. In SPRU we're also working on not ranking, but mapping.
Yeah.
So difference instead of ranking.
Categorizing different types of universities.
Yes, yes.
Any form of ranking is a uniformization of the whole set of objects that you analyze.
So let's get away from rankings.
Yes.
Okay. Carlota, do you want to add something? I just will follow.
Yeah, just quickly, I just want to thank you, and for the comments as well. It's going to be definitely enriching for my research, analyzing this particular institution in Brazil. And could someone please take a picture so I can put it in front of my CV?
Luke. Well, I mean, I must admit that I feel a bit embarrassed on the issues about fees, because actually I was one of the experts which Tony Blair invited at Hampton Court to discuss the introduction of fees within British universities back in I'm talking about the 90s. And of course this was organized by the Social Democrats, the policy unit. And from a social democracy point of view, the fact that you have no fees is basically quite unequal, in the sense that of course you fund from the average taxpayer, you fund people who will later on earn, in all likelihood, have a high rate of return to the education they've received, etc. And so this was a big debate. But we convinced Blair basically to start with the tuition fee structure, which was £3,000, I think, at that time. And the idea was, of course, that the £3,000 would be fully invested into universities, and they would be free to use it also for scholarships, etc., to keep the access open, etc. We never thought that the Conservatives would, of course, take this idea over and double it, etc., etc. But I still think that there is an issue here. There is an inequality issue with respect to the no fees, which you have in Uruguay, because you basically have that the average person pays for the education of people who will later on, in all likelihood, have much higher incomes thanks to the education they've received. We are playing with the idea, I mean, I'm playing with the idea for the moment to really shift the whole system. And there's a lot of literature on this, which is that what you would do is to give all students or all families which have people of 18 years you could say not a basic income, but an income or a revenue or a voucher or whatever you may call it for education, according to their choice. And that can be lifelong, or that can be following immediately after their secondary education. And that amount of money, they can spend it on what they want. So you shift the whole system into giving the power back into the hands of the students, or the potential students, etc. That would create, of course, a tremendous competition to be attractive in terms of the study you provide, the employability of those studies, etc. And it would take the power away from the universities as institutions, which would make them also independent of the state, because it is the financial dependency which makes them, of course, so dependent on state control, etc. And the couple of countries where you have independence, autonomy, is often by accident, because there was a guy who didn't pay attention and they gave full autonomy at universities, etc. You can see this in the Netherlands. Johan introduced this, and people now all want to get back to control. So from this perspective, my line would be that it might be time to have a radical shift towards funding universities through the students and to the choices they make. This is a very liberal view, of course, a very competitive view, but it could lead to a much stronger influence, not students voting for rectors, but students voting by their feet in terms of where they go to. And I think this is also where the last point I want to make on this ranking is where multi-ranking as an alternative idea, which the Commission is pushing, but which is not becoming popularized by the Times or all the other agencies who are doing the rankings, would solve some of this unique ranking on focusing on say, very artificial ways of putting research and education in certain rankings. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah?
Oh, please.
It is related with Carlota, not exactly with what Carlota said today, but with something that I always quote when I give classes about Carlota. When he talked about the shifting socio-technical paradigms, she always said that one of the points is shifting the common sense of engineers. This is what, well, a developmental university wants to shift the common sense of all researchers, build another common sense, so they can see in the new technologies the opportunities to solve problems that nobody else but ourselves are going to look at how to solve. So I think that in this sense, what she said is perhaps the most hopeful thing related with what we want to do. Thank you.
Well, do you want to have the final word? You already, we're given the final word by Judith, but
I think education is going to be so important, and it depends so much on the major policies and the major innovations that we make about it. I think education should be something that penetrates the whole of society. This whole idea that you have kindergarten first, it's like a refinery, you put all the oil in the bitter, and you come out first the heavy things, and then the others, and then the very light ones go at the top, and then they become rich and these become poor. The system is like a mass production, like making sausages. And we've got to have something that's completely open, that people learn different things, that people come to university not for a degree and for a thing, but I just like that particular course and I pay and I go to that course and I'm working in this thing. I wonder if a university has a course on this, and then you go, and then people, and then taxes out, no taxes for learning, no taxes for teaching, and, really turn the information thing, learning as the lifeblood of a society. So that means so many changes. But of course, the university will also be there. But I think that society has to become like a sort of university, a system for democratizing, for sharing knowledge in all sorts of ways, and the whole framework would be favoring that. But of course, that's far from possible, but it's not impossible. I always think of a queue of soup kitchens in the 1930s, and how those guys that were hungry and that were getting the soup kitchens and were unemployed, if somebody had said, you know what, in about 6 years after a horrible war we're going to have and you're going to participate in, you're going to have a house, a car, electrical appliances, you're going to have a supermarket where you're going, you know, and your children are going to go to school, and your children will probably graduate from university. You know, it seems so impossible, but it happened. I mean, only in a few countries. But I think we've got to start thinking of major change and to set up frameworks that will bring that major change. And I think it's really possible. It's just not probable.
Okay, a big applause for the panel of the We are a bit late for drinks, sorry for that, but I think it was a great debate. It's room 118? 118.
So straight across here, the side.
There's a reception.
Well, thank you very much.
So much.
Did he get his picture?
Did you get the picture?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bárbara. Sí. Igual nos la va a mandar para poder.
Know about the Perez, about the learning society.
Oh, yes, we're mostly how
I can send you the email of the report. We did it for the last government, but also the present government was interested in.
who did that?
Also Atade is his name. And he runs a very interesting university-based kind of, new courses where students do things with their hands. Students develop games themselves. He also teaches, he calls them the savant durée, so savant adventures. And they involve both the students from local schools with migration background, etc. It's a fantastic place. And
please let us know about it, and thank you very much for pointing.
I will put you in contact.
Excellent, excellent. We thank you. ¿De dónde vienes? Ah, eres casi uruguayo. Una mezcla de Brasil y Argentina se llama Uruguay. Muy bueno conocer. Bueno, un gran gusto para nosotros y ojalá nos mantengamos listo para conversar con todo el mundo, particularmente con gente corriente de nuestro país.